Okay, great to be here. Thank you. So this title, Capitalism, Laws, and the Need for Trustworthy Institution, is a title of a paper that I wrote recently for a volume of Oxford, A Review of Economic Policy, which asked a whole bunch of people, mostly economists, the following question. Capitalism, what has gone wrong, what needs to change, and how to fix it? All in 5,000 words, including old-fashioned references. That's pretty daunting. Capitalism, what does it even mean to people? So people throw the words around. So I wanted to start with definition, we'll see. But that's my bottom line, that essentially what's gone wrong with capitalism is in this form that we're familiar with it in our Western democracies. It has overwhelmed democracies, basically, and has led to a combined crisis of capitalism and democracy. In people's perceptions, something went wrong, but we need to diagnose exactly what it is to kind of do something about it. So I'm going backwards, forward. Okay, so people throw around, in the United States in particular, people throw around these two big words. Socialism is like a curse. Socialist, and of course, the U.S. is the center of what people call capitalism, and they carry this with pride. This doesn't really work, so I'm gonna. And what they also throw around capitalism is free market, as free market capitalism and big government socialism. So this sort of distinction is made that the definition of capitalism by this is it's not socialism, whatever socialism even is. So in this debate, which is very, very muddled and presents completely false choices and doesn't really get what's going on, even the dictionary definition goes there. So a definition in a dictionary says capitalism is a way of organizing the economy that's kind of in the private sector, not socialism. The means, the things that are used to make and transport products are owned by individuals and people and companies rather than the government. So it's about who owns the means of production, etc. So note that there is the word owned here. Okay, so we'll come back to that. Socialism is defined as things are owned by the government and not by the private sector. So it's really private sector owns things, government owns things. But what does ownership actually mean, especially by the private sector? What does it mean to own? How do people and companies come to own anything? So now you're talking about property rights. Okay, so here we go. In other words, we need a legal infrastructure to even discuss these words like ownership of things. And then when you get to trade and markets and contracts and all of that, you definitely need legal infrastructure. So everybody throws around these words and ignores the legal infrastructure, which has layers and layers of things associated with it about how it actually works. Who writes it? Who enforces it? How does it actually work? Numerous details. So all of that in this simplistic discussion, all that is ignored. And often indeed ignored in economics, in the field of economics. We write down a contract, voila, contract. And so in economics, there's a huge emphasis on contracts. This goes back to Coase, goes back to Jensen and Meckling. They say organizations are a fiction, it's all a nexus of contracts. Contracts between individuals, that's it. You put it around in a company, but that doesn't mean anything. Asking what should the objective function of the company be is meaningless. Here we are talking about the purpose of the corporation, ESG, impact investing, all of that. They're saying, no, a bunch of contracts, that's it. Okay? The behavior of a firm is like a market. It's just an equilibrium, and there's contracts, and there's markets, and all of that. So once again, we use words. So some definitions of capitalism say it's free markets and competition and corporations, all these words. Where do they come to be? How do they get to run? How do they operate at all without a legal infrastructure? They can't, certainly not at scale. Okay, we can have a little village with their, economy that operates, but at scale that we have right now, at the scale of corporations that we have, at the scale of markets that we have, at the global economy that we have, the legal infrastructure is actually very complicated in the legal infrastructure and the forces that affect it, namely who writes, the politics of that, therefore, and the enforcement issues, is where a lot of the action is on economic outcomes. So economists, by ignoring this, are kind of missing the big elephant in the room, which is sort of all these institutional issues. I started teaching a course at Stanford Business School where I just wanted to start really where I can get the students from something that they could maybe relate to. Let's start talking about human rights, okay? We used to think that it's okay to own people. We used to have slavery. So we decided, in terms of ownership, that we don't own other people anymore, or at least we disapprove of that. So many nations signed the UN Declaration, has 30 articles, they all sound great. Human rights. What is that? Okay, it's an agreement between countries that says all kinds of good things that humans are entitled to somehow. But how do they come to have those rights, and who is going to protect those rights? Okay, big question. Now we're talking about, first of all, what do people care about? Okay, so you can start talking about ethics or about the impact of laws or the impact of where we consider, where we have incentives, where we have emotions, only ourselves, the people around us, our country, the world, who do we care about? Okay, some tribe, some religion, etc. Okay, so human rights, who's going to protect them? Is it going to be national governments? And then is it going to be international bodies? Is there international law, soft law, hard law? What's the enforcement mechanisms? So when students are saying, okay, China signed the declaration and violates human rights, now what? Who can challenge China? Now, of course, we have war crimes maybe. Can you go to, so all of a sudden you're in the world of institutions and their powers and their enforcement and their legitimacy, all of that. Okay, so you know that the things that you want, somebody needs to make happen. And who is that going to be? Are people and corporations and businesses going to make sure, because they want to, that we protect human rights? That everybody has freedom of speech and health and education and all sorts of good stuff that human rights declaration aspires to assert we have. Okay, this is again the slide with emphasis on another word, the word companies. So here it says individuals or companies, and here again it says individuals or companies. So what's that? Who is that? What is that? Okay, well, what it is for the most part is corporations. So corporations are the winning organizational form in the private sector. Okay, so very brief history of the corporate form. The form that we know right now started in the 17th century in Netherlands and in England, okay, with the Dutch East India and the English East India companies. They were extensions of the government, basically. They had armies and they went and conquered and all of that. And the key there, and I'll talk about that, so as we evolve, and in the United States, corporations were very special in order to get a corporate charter. So it starts with entities that live in the law as entities, legal people, and they were municipalities and churches. They need to have long life beyond individuals, and so they have a longevity, and they are able to own things, to sign contracts, all of that. So you give them a legal personhood, and then you now start giving it to companies funded with private money. And then in the US it was very special, and in other countries you needed a special charter, needed a vote of Congress to become a corporation. And then, you needed to say why you need to incorporate. What is it going to do? And in the beginning they were doing infrastructure projects. The government didn't have as much money, and so they would build bridges or canals or highways or something like that. By now, for various reasons, incorporation is extremely easy. Essentially free in corporations. You pay a few dollars in Delaware and voila, you have a corporation. You don't even have to say who you are. It's easier to form a corporation in the US than to get a library card. You don't even need an ID. They're trying to change that, but it is really quite remarkable. Okay, so In one address in Delaware, this is back in 2012, there were 285,000 corporations. Because you don't need, Delaware is the capital of incorporation. Incorporation in the US is a state thing, I'll tell you in a second. And Delaware is winning, is funding itself with these fees of people who just come in and become corporations. So all of a sudden you got millions of corporations in Delaware, in UK, various other places. So you call yourself something, you say whatever you say you want to do, nobody checks. And unless you become a public corporation, then you have some requirements, you're pretty much in the dark. Unless you do something that calls attention to yourself in some fashion, you can have no employees, you could just exist for secrecy or for some other reasons. So what's the key features? Corporations are abstract, so very different from nexus of contract. They are created by law, okay? And they exist separate from every human being. So when you say Apple, Facebook, all these companies, they're a thing. They're a thing in the law. They're an abstract thing, okay? But they're a thing in the law. And they're separate from all individuals. So there's an individual and there's a corporation, okay? In the US, they're created by state law. So corporate law is state law in the US. And the way they're governed is they have a charter, they have the law, the corporate law that says something about boards of directors or about who can do what or what happens if they merge, all kinds of fiduciaries, all kinds of corporate law, things that may or may not matter depending on the way they own it. It's very flexible about ownership and control and all of that. So again, they derive their existence to begin with and their legal rights from legal systems, from governments and from courts. So if they go to court and say, hey, I need to have speech right, I need to have, religious rights, whatever, constitutional rights in the US, the court decides if they deserve it as a person. And there is a sort of piercing of the veil and all of that, we'll talk about that. They get property. So obviously for functioning, they need to own things, they need to be able to sign contracts, they need to be able to sue and be sued, so they exist as a legal person. The key thing about the corporation is, in fact, its separateness. So what makes it tick is the fact that the corporation owns the fund that it owns and nobody can reach it, except through some governance mechanism. In other words, a shareholder, owner, you might say, cannot walk into a corporation, take a chair. They don't actually own the assets. They own a piece of paper that says you have a share, if you pay your debt, if the corporation decides to pay your dividend or to liquidate and give you money, you have certain rights in the law. But not ownership right like on the assets, okay? So it's a financial thing, and other people have contracts. So the shareholders have a special kind of residual claim. Everybody else has some kind of relationship, or they're just impacted. The corporation could pollute or something like that. Now in the US, they fought for all kinds of rights. They even have political speech rights, so they can spend as much money on politics as they want. The corporation, whoever decides for them, okay? And they even have a religious right, meaning that a corporation came to the Supreme Court and said, we don't want to abide by the Obamacare healthcare law because we, the owners of the corporations, there's a privately held corporation, it violates our religious beliefs to have to give, contraceptives or abortion or something like that. And the corporation got exempted from that law because the owners of the shares are religious. So the rights flow often from people to corporations. But as we will see, responsibilities don't flow as easily. So the problem is, for rights, there's piercing of the veil. For responsibility, nobody's home, basically. So that's kind of part of the problem and the asymmetry of that. So the key is that there is a veil that separates all individuals from these things that I drew as a bunch of buildings, headquarters or something like that. Obviously, there are people there who make decisions. There's a board, there's a structure. But all the people, including the shareholders, have an existence and a preference or a relationship with the corporation, but they can only have certain legal dealings with it or governance type of dealings with it. So these are 3 books, including by Ron Harris from right here, about the history of corporations and the history of corporate rights in the US. We, the corporations, like the Constitution never mentioned corporation, we the people. and then corporations came to court and argued that they deserve civil rights. They didn't go marching on for civil rights, but they went to court. They hired the best lawyers on the land and got more and more and more rights over the years. Okay, the anarchy is specific to the East India, English East India, and how its own story of. So in the false dichotomy that I talked about before, again, the summary: corporations, contracts, markets cannot operate without a legal system. So that's the infrastructure. And then it becomes a question of how that gets determined. Who writes the laws? Who enforces the law? What's the whole system around it, the political economy, of how it comes about that, somebody has money to pay a lawyer to go do things, that certain regulatory agency is going to do something, et cetera, et cetera. So now you have a whole structure that has costs and people with incentives, a whole self-governance structure that does all of that. Who enforces? So enforcement is a big thing. So the competence and integrity of the legal systems that are making all this work matter a lot. And yet it's just kind of underground and we don't often look at it, but it matters a lot. So the institutions are critical. You have government institutions, sovereign governments, and then you have global corporate these days. So the world is composed of a lot of institutions. And you have the meta global institution, NATO, whatever nowadays we talk, the UN, IMF, all these institutions, lots of institutions. Sovereigns and local governments, on and on, okay? And then there are the corporations that have a lot of choices in the law. They choose where to incorporate, they choose where to write their contracts, they choose who's going to enforce their contracts. There's a lot of shopping of law in this global economy. The big legal systems are US and London. So New York law, Delaware law, UK law, in much of the system that we know. And they have agreements about respecting other people's laws when they come into conflict, except for bankruptcy law. So bankruptcy is very contentious because bankruptcy is where you have to split the pie, somebody loses, that's always political. But on other laws, there's a lot of freedoms. So governance is a framework that I use a lot, which is just you have an institution, it's a government institution, it's a private institution, it's a global institution, whatever it is. How are decisions made and how is it impacted? So who makes decisions? What's their information? What's their constraints? What is their authority to make the decision on behalf of the institution, act on behalf of the institution? It could be a low level, high level, etc. And what are their incentives? What are their motivation? Bottom line, how's everybody impacted by that? So a governance issue is the governance working for society ultimately? A governance structure, and how did it come to work or not work, okay? And if it doesn't work, what do we do about that? So governance is about some big words. Power, information, incentives. These are big words associated with governance. And what makes it effective usually is trust, okay? We'll unpack that. Commitment. I can deal with you because I can make commitments that I won't harm you. And I have a force behind it, that's the force of the law or the force that you somehow trust, have a reason to trust my promises, okay? So all exchange is built on that, and they're sort of built into it are systems of accountability, where if I violate a promise, there's something that happens. Otherwise, promises mean nothing. So the theme also here is talk is cheap, how do we bind people to what they say or what they promise, okay? So how do we get these good things to happen? How do we create trust? How do we create accountability? How do we enable commitments? It's difficult to commit because what if I can just break it? I can just say, promise, okay? And can it work in the dark? If I can't see what you're doing, if I can't diagnose what happened, then how can I create accountability and how can I create trust? So the big words power, what makes people powerful? Who gave them power? And what makes them trustworthy? In other words, how do they come to be such that people can trust them and then sort of the system can work so that when they make decisions for other people, they won't cause harm, okay? So let's talk about corporate governance. Corporate governance is dominated in the last 50 years by this famous lines of Milton Friedman. The social responsibility of corporate managers, he said, is to make as much money as possible, however you operationalize that, while conforming to the basic rules of society. So he did say that as embodied in the law and in ethical customs. So he's saying, obey the law and then make as much money as possible. That's what corporations should do. But he takes the rules of society as given, et cetera, et cetera. We'll talk about the assumptions that are made here for saying that it is a social responsibility, meaning if they did that, that is all they need to do for the world. The rest will take care of itself, okay? So there's a logic to it, but it depends on assumptions, and that's... So the standard view of how you operationalize that is you compensate managers with shareholders' interest by giving them financialized metrics like stock price or accounting profits or return on equity or something like that, so that they will care about these financialized things, okay? And that's the way we teach it in finance. In a corporate finance textbook, we say the goal of the firm should be determined. This is in a preface, and then we go off to the races to do all kinds of calculations. These are courses I've taught for 25 years, determined by the firm's owners. So we confuse shareholders with owners. We call them owners, but it's a little bit of a slip, technically. Shareholders agree that they're better off if managers maximize the stock price, as if the shareholder, all that they care about in life is the stock price of one company at a time. So there isn't even any portfolio consideration or all these things about common ownership and all that, okay? So nowadays, shareholder focus is questioned, and here's this cartoon. Yes, the world got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment of time, we created a lot of value for our shareholders. So, the smoking town in the background. And recently, there have been all kinds of business leaders saying how they care about everybody, not just about shareholders. So here you have 181 CEOs of the top companies in the US. This is just the CEOs, that they weren't signing on behalf of their corporation. Let's distinguish people in corporations. The CEO is obviously the most important person, but they signed on their own name. They didn't consult with the board. It wasn't on the name of the company, but they say that their corporations are committed, they are committed to delivering values to customers. They first mentioned customers, employees, suppliers, communities, and also shareholders, by the way, okay? For the future success of our companies, our communities, and our society. This was a statement that they made to great fanfare, covered everywhere. Okay, the Business Roundtable statement of corporate responsibility. And back in Davos, where all the big shots get together, they have a manifesto about the universal purpose of the company. The Davos Manifesto, the purpose of the company is to engage all stakeholders in shared and sustained value creation. If you can tell me exactly what this means, please do, but sounds good, right? Sounds great. So effective rules can build trust, can build commitment. I have to abide this rule. I have to drive below the speed limit because the cop will stop me if I don't. You can trust me going on the road because a policeman is standing there. So we created a speed limit so that I'm not afraid to go on the road. So that's the logic of that. Now the rules are written everywhere. There are rules that are written by governments and government bodies, and there are certain names to them. Okay, laws, regulations, treaties, directives, executive orders, whatever. And then there are a set of rules that are written by private companies in the private sector. All the charters, and they're sort of closer to contracts, or they could just be statements, charters, terms of service, community standards, all these things that, Facebook decides what can stay on and off, etc. Facebook decided, Facebook has to enforce. Big controversies, but it's a set of rules that they wrote and they have to decide how to enforce, okay? So rules are written everywhere, okay? And all rules need some enforcement, some adjudication. Here is Facebook creating a Supreme Court, to decide, whether Trump should be on or off or whatever. Violated some rule, okay? So referees, okay? Referees, like in a game of soccer, football, whatever. Here is the player lobbying with the referee. The audience on both sides wants fair game, okay? So in the political discourse, laws are considered essential. Rule of law, we need laws. Obviously we need laws. This is a rules-based system, says Biden, etc., etc. What rules? Now, if you say the word regulation, especially around Silicon Valley, that's a dirty word. That word just is a negative connotation. It's bad, it's costly. Okay, so laws, but that's, again, All of them are rules. They were all in the government bucket under rules. The difference between law and regulation is just technical. Who writes the letter of it? Who writes the actual words? Is it the regulatory authority? Is it the legislature? Who is it? And what are the enforcement tools of the rule? So but it's all rules. Rules written by a government, usually laws, regulations, okay? Or they could be, any rule needs to consider, when you say a rule is costly, obviously it's costly to enforce it. It's costly maybe to comply with it. But, if I can't steal your money, it's privately costly to me, but rules are about social costs and private costs. So this notion of costly often gets muddled with my cost versus everybody's cost, overall cost. So obviously if I could take your money, that would benefit me, and if you prohibit me, that's costly to me. But we decided it's not okay for me to reach and take your money or steal something from you or whatever, okay? So then the question is the balance of social cost, social benefit for having the rules, including the enforcement and all of that. Does it correct something? And so what's the whole thing around it, okay? So the devil is often in the details, because it's very oftentimes lengthy and complicated and needs lawyers to decide how to do it. And enforcement is key, and trying to get around rule is the name of the game often. These rules will change the way we get around them, meaning I'll find the way around the rules. So now, how good are the rules at preventing all kinds of loopholes, et cetera, et cetera? So that's why it gets a little bit complicated. So now if you take Milton Friedman and try to unpack what he's saying, yes, his claim would be valid if everybody agreed that that's what they care about, the stock price. If the markets were free and competitive, which later he assumes also somehow happens, okay? So the managers should operate in free and competitive market without deception and fraud. He even says that later in the article. So he needs to assume that managers do not engage in deception and fraud, and that the rules of society that protect everybody else. So you don't have to worry about everybody else. The laws, the contracts, the markets will take care of it, okay? That's the big assumption. How do we know that's true? Okay, in fact, that's usually not true. So the whole thing falls apart once these assumptions are false, that are behind the logic that this is social responsibility of the managers, under the assumption that the rest is just taken care of. The rest, everybody has contracts, everybody has laws, everybody has markets to protect them, competition, etc. So the public, the creditors, the customers, the employees, they all are taken care of by the system somehow. And therefore, let's just focus on shareholders, managers, and how they will not waste resources or whatever, and how they'll make them as much money as possible. What if instead shareholders are people that also double up as people, taxpayers? We're all shareholders when we have savings of some companies. We're all employees of somebody. We're all buying lots of products, so we're all consumers. We're all taxpayers, citizens, etc. So it's like, what does it mean, a shareholder, a stakeholder? It's a people. What do they want as people? So that's a question. And what if the governments fail to do the right thing in terms of rules, in terms of enforcement, and in terms of protecting all kinds of things that we as a society feel should be protected? What if corporations themselves get involved in the writing of the rules and in the enforcement of the rules? What if they're able to actually cause harm with little consequences? Then the entire apparatus falls apart. It no longer follows logically that that's the social responsibility of managers, because it would be far from socially responsible thing to cause harm repeatedly. But if there is incentive to do that, and you can, then why not? Maybe you would. It depends on your ethics, maybe. So talk is cheap. So Davos and the CEOs, it's PR, okay? They want to say it. It's not clear what they actually do, and who's going to hold them accountable to a bunch of good words that they said, okay? And they could deceive you. This says, trust me, and behind it, it says, I'm lying, okay? Well, maybe I'm aware that I'm lying, maybe I'm believing my own words, maybe I think I'm a good person, whatever. I don't know psychology as much, but, people say something and believe their own words, but can you believe them? So, for example, BlackRock Larry Fink likes to say we lecture CEOs that they should worry about sustainability and about all kinds of good things. But they just recently had somebody who was part of their, impact, ESG funds and all of that, saying it's all a placebo, it's a distraction, it diverts our attention from needing to worry about what the government should do to solve these problems by sort of lecturing to CEOs or hoping companies will do it voluntarily when they're in a competitive marketplace and try to get whatever, cheap chocolates with child labor or whatever, okay? And when they come to the states, BlackRock says to states that have a lot of gas and oil and fossil fuel, don't worry about our CEOs, what he's saying. We want to do business in this state. And some states, like Texas, are saying if you discriminate against, coal companies or gun companies or whatever, you can't operate in this state. Well, it's a big state, so I want to operate, so let's not worry about the rhetoric of our CEO. So the question is, do corporations actually, in practice, in reality, obey the rules of society? Because Friedman said, make as much money as possible while conforming to the rules of society. So there's a lot of evidence that they don't. This is a famous saying, it's not that famous, but I found it and thought it was interesting. A criminal is a person with predatory instinct, but without sufficient capital to form a corporation. He said this back, more than 100 years ago. And a paraphrase on that is that today you can easily form a corporation. And in fact, you can form a corporation raising money from all kinds of people and cause a lot of harm. So in other words, once you're in the corporate form, all kinds of things become possible, and you can do this, unlike the criminal that had to do it himself because he couldn't get enough money to form a corporation. So a lot of corporate harm is what's called lawful but awful. In other words, the law doesn't prohibit certain chemicals from being used in the US, and then you change the name of it, and the onus is on the EPA to prove that it's harmful. So DuPont and other companies use many, many tricks to continue to pollute without much harm. Purdue Pharma, I don't need to tell you the story of Purdue Pharma, but that was a privately held company. The name has been on buildings in this campus too, and they were the ones that benefited from selling an addictive product that they misled everybody into thinking is less addictive than it is, similar to cigarettes, etc. But the harm from opioids was very, very extreme and caused massive harm, and there would not be any justice. And the question is, how they all got away with that, with no individual seriously paying any cost. And the strategy was a strategy that involved a lot of deception, a lot of deceptive marketing, deceiving the FDA, and somehow convincing people. So that's a theme here about the power of deception in this world. So our Attorney General in the US said that corporations only act through individuals, and justice means that, equal treatment of everybody who breaks the law. But how do you treat the corporation that breaks the law? What do you do then? Prison is not a thing for corporations. So now what do you do? So Boeing, so that's another example from recently. The company, in competing with Airbus, changed some software on the 737 MAX and didn't feel it was useful or cost beneficial for them to train the pilots on this change, and so they covered up the change. The pilots didn't know, and then a plane crashed in Indonesia. They blamed the pilots and claimed that the plane is safe, and it kept flying until an Ethiopian Air plane crashed, and altogether killing 346 people. And it's like, oh, oops. So the plane is grounded, the shareholders are losing money, these people lost lives that can't come back, etc. These are the families holding pictures, and whether justice was ever done with that, you can watch a movie, you can read now a book about this. Flying blind in the race to beat the competition. Boeing skimped on testing, pressured employee to meet unrealistic deadline, convinced regulators they can take care of it. And I used to always, for many years when I was talking about banking, I said, well, in aviation safety, it all works. I got here by airplane. I'll show there's a black box. Everything works. The incentives are right. that's the extreme case where it works. Until now, it didn't work for Boeing. So even there, you could have a problem, where if the Federal Aviation Agency allowed Boeing to kind of write its own rules and trusted that they will know what's flight worthy and safe, and they didn't. Obviously, cut the corners and endanger the people. In the end, the headline number is, Department of Justice went after them. They paid $2.5 billion. They had a lot of money. Well, we can unpack this disclosure, but the bottom line of it is that it released the management from responsibility, and a lot of the $2.5 billion actually went to airline customers, and some of it was very little penalties there. It was product liability things that the Department of Justice took credit for. But the Department of Justice now wants to say, you have to give us all the individuals that were responsible so we can go after individuals. So what do companies do? They throw somebody under the bus, oftentimes a lower level employee. So they give the Department of Justice evidence against somebody. In this case, it was a test pilot, low level, who's no longer there, that they gave the Department of Justice emails that he knew, et cetera, et cetera. Now, why would a low-level employee get up in the morning and decide to cheat the FAA? Obviously was doing it for the higher-ups and not for himself. Similar to why would tellers in Wells Fargo open fraudulent accounts? Certainly they didn't want to do that for themselves. So it obviously was an incentive from above on behalf of somebody in the corporations or investors or whatever. And the pilot was acquitted within 2 hours. So it was a scapegoat, basically. It was thrown out of the bus for something that really he had no direct interest in or incentives to do. So that's the guy. What was his incentive? What about the higher up? So I'm going to go quickly over. This is a case that's very hot in California, where I live. So our utility, PG&E, look at this fire burning. Pacific Gas and Electric is the one monopoly that gives us the power, and it is quite the story about this company. It is an investor-owned utility, so the investors live in New York or someplace else, and all the rest of the stakeholders are in California. They pay their rate, they're taxpayers, their houses might get burned, et cetera, et cetera. Well, PG&E for years and decades didn't maintain its equipment, and of course some of it was just their bad equipment, and some of it was exacerbated obviously by climate change and a lot of fire and land management and other issues. But so they had like disastrous, decade or more, especially since 2010. Right now, there was a fire in which this was fire. There were 2017 fire, 2018 fire, then there were 2019, 2020, etc. It filed for bankruptcy. After the bankruptcy, the fire victims got to own a quarter of the stocks. It was really an unbelievable settlement, and they hedge funds that came in through that bankruptcy cashed out and left. Meanwhile, in one of these fires, 85 people died, 84 were attributed to PG&E. And before they went out of bankruptcy, and this was already in COVID, 2020, June, the CEO went to court and pleaded guilty for the corporation for 84 counts of manslaughter. And that means that a person killing 84 people would sit in jail for 90 years, but this is a corporation, so the maximum penalty was like $3.5 million plus a little fees, so $4 million. That's it. So the judge is saying, well, that's the maximum I can do under the law. So if you have a civil settlement, you might get more money out of them, but basically if they kill people, and no individual was at all involved in that. So for a fire that happened in 2010, they were also criminally charged, and they had a monitor, just like you have a probation officer for a criminal person. They had a monitor, and they came out of that only in January 2022. And when they came out of this probation with a monitor that was supposed to rehabilitate the criminal corporation, the judge said in these 5 years, PG&E has gone on a crime spree and will emerge from probation as a continuing menace to California. So this is a corporation, but we're stuck with it. I mean, if the governor doesn't want to dissolve it and do something else, nobody wants to manage a utility in California. So the judge Elsop wrote in a report, he said, we tried hard to rehabilitate PG&E and we failed. This is after it came out of bankruptcy and the fire victims, the stock price went down and now they have less money and it's a trust that they don't have any claims against the corporation. Here, 70,000 California wildfire victims lost everything and they're fighting for money to rebuild, but they have no more claims against PG&E because once it's out of bankruptcy, all the claims are resolved. And so they now have a trust. The trust is losing value anyway. It's kind of a mess. You can have wage theft. So again, it raises interesting questions about the difference between something that people do and something that corporations do. So if I shoplift, that's a crime. I can be taken to the police, I can be, etc. If a corporation doesn't pay wages that they promised to pay, that's like a little contract dispute that would be adjudicated someplace. No big deal. So it kind of doesn't sound as serious as basically taking somebody's money, which the bottom line is, some people call it wage theft. So there's a website that does this. So the difference, so then they sometimes would call it fraud and that would make it criminal sometime, but otherwise it's like, and here's a person who worked and didn't get paid. And by the time they process a little complaint she has, the company went bankrupt. So good luck to her. Now in the movie The Big Short, which was out of the financial crisis, I dropped everything about the financial crisis. I've talked about it for many years. So it's all part of why I'm here. Again, it's sort of the borderline between legal and illegal. So a lot of what was in The Big Short was legal, what was described. It was the regulation enabled it. But the movie, not the book, the movie ends with why nobody went to jail. Now, for the things that were legal, nobody's going to go to jail. So the book actually ends, the Michael Lewis book ends by saying that the big bad moment for Wall Street came when some of these partnerships became big corporations, and all of a sudden there was a lot of recklessness with other people's money. And he ends by saying the problem is not why Lehman Brothers wasn't bailed out, but why it was allowed to succeed in the first place originally. So the problem was came before how we allowed this system to operate. So the banks paid tons of penalties. This is just 2017, and they already paid $321 billion. I don't know which group of banks is, but hundreds of billions of dollars in fines. But they make a lot of money, so it's okay, cost of doing business. So they sometimes get slapped with a fine for all kinds of things that they do. So it kind of is like the punishment you get in elementary school. Write it 1,000 times, you won't do it again, you won't do it again, because a lot of the settlements say, we'll never do it again. And then they all move on and go home. Okay, so a judge that I admire greatly, that's really my mentor recently, Judge Rakoff, who was a prosecutor, a defense lawyer for 17 years, and now a judge for over 25 years, wrote this book recently, Why the Innocent Plead Guilty and the Guilty Go Free, and Other Paradoxes of Our Broken Legal System. This is the U.S. legal system, center of enlightened, capitalism. So we imprison a lot of people, we force them, basically, they don't have access to lawyers, we threaten them with 20 years, they admit guilt to go for 5 years, maybe not even if they're guilty, we have flimsy evidence in court, but if it's a corporation and executives, they go off free. So, and then he blames judges for not speaking up. So he said it's a very unjust system and he needs to speak up. So that's my research at the moment. I'm really immersed in this corporate justice issue, meaning the corporation in the legal system and how the law is written, who gets rights in the legal system to do something if they're harmed, who writes the laws that may prevent the harm, what are the remedies, etc. So I have this research with a colleague of mine where we asked, does the legal system provide remedies for people who are harmed by corporations? Does it depend who they are as what they're complaining? They were harmed as shareholders because they were deceived. They were harmed as customers. They were harmed as employees. Or some regulator says you broke the law and does something to the corporations. How do the outcome depend on who it is or how they were harmed, physical versus, obviously shareholders never get killed that I know of from the harm. It's usually financial harm, but employees and customers and the public can get physically harmed. And how does the enforcement mechanism affect it? Preliminary results are quite the opposite of what people say. The justice system protects everybody, but the shareholders need special rights because otherwise they won't give the corporation the money. It's the shareholders, when they are harmed, that actually get the legal system to do a lot more. They have the right to use class action suits when the stock price goes down. The regulators that are charged with protecting them are more active, better funded, et cetera, relative to protection of, and the government also tends to be strong when it is harmed. Say if you defraud the government, it would go more criminally, it would go more to individuals, et cetera, than if customers. But for customers and employees nowadays in the US, it's a lot of mandatory arbitration. So when you agree to terms of service, or so hundreds of thousands of these agreements, in the small print it says that you cannot sue them if you disagree, if you got harmed. You have to go to arbitration that is completely opaque, and that has no appeals, that not even for error of fact or law. It's very opaque system. Some of it we don't see, but it's clear that the corporations want it, and therefore they do better in it because it allows them to cover up some of the harm and kind of prevents people from collaborating. It has class action waivers and all kinds of things like that. So the question is, can we do more to prevent harm? Laws are different in different countries. I'm just flagging this, and I really don't know a lot about Israeli law in that case. I am going to talk to some legal scholars here, but I don't know as much about Israeli law, but I invite all of you to look into that. In Germany, for example, you cannot criminalize a corporation. In the US, you can. In the US, the corporation is vicariously liable for all everything that was done by anybody in the corporation in the context of their work. So if in the context of any employee, anybody did anything, the corporation is liable in order to get the deep pockets of the corporations to help pay remedies or whatever, but it ends up transferring the responsibility to the corporation from the individuals, even though it doesn't preclude going after the individuals. In European countries, oftentimes the law does not even conceive of the corporation as breaking criminal law. So they just don't have the possibility in the law. So democracy is another thing, but I'm running out of time. Democracy is the governance of people. So, Madison said, if men were angels, we wouldn't need government. And then in the US Constitution, the key in the Constitution is to protect the people from the government, so to constrain the government, okay? However, when it comes to corporations, they're created by governments and laws, and the question is how to prevent them from owning the law. Okay, that's the question I'm asking. Madison likely didn't envision corporations in their current form, okay? So the question is then how to make the government serve society, if you kind of do an analogy. So that's for democracy, the question, okay? And the answer is, first of all, educated citizenry. So that's essential. And unfortunately, that's kind of where things also break down, because there's a lot of confusion. And effective democracy requires that citizens are kind of informed and are committed to democracy, basically, but which is a whole set of institutions, including media and judiciary, et cetera, et cetera. But what if people with power actually don't support democracy really deep down? I read a book about Peter Thiel. He's not into democracy particularly. He's a very powerful person right now in the US. And confusion and deception is a tool. So this cuts across markets and politics, that if you can deceive and you can get into people's head to convince them that they want to buy a product, they want to accept an idea, whatever it is, or in the courts, you persuade, you convince, maybe you deceive if you need to. So the power to do this, and you can call it marketing or lobbying or advocating in court, matters. That's why we have professionals that do that, okay? So in the end, you can look at definitions of corruption. Corruption is the abuse of power, and then you can look at the word crony capitalism, which is sort of a corrupted form of capitalism. And nowadays, there are books that argue that the US and the UK are the centers of corruption, of dirty money, okay? Meaning the corporate form often, or other forms of ownership, real estate, others, is a way to launder criminal money, meaning that we are allowing the breaking of other laws, drug dealers or other corrupt situations come into Londongrad, what they now call it, and in the Butler for the World, they say everything's for sale in UK. Since they gave up imperialism, colonialism, they just, you can go hide money in UK. But this book, American Kleptocracy, says the US is the one where you can hide money the most. Not offshore, right? Onshore, okay? So let's not, so this is my final slide, we don't have to choose between capitalism and socialism. So this whole thing is just off. It just sends us into all these stupid debates, okay? What we need is a system. So, you know, how big the government is, it should be big enough to do what it needs to do, okay? Every institution should be efficient and not wasteful in the private sector and in government. And we need a system of rules that make it work, make trade happen and enables what we need corporations to do without undue harm, and creates the right incentives for all of that. So we need better governance everywhere. And for that, we need to, first of all, understand the issues and then kind of put in place the right kind of rules to make a system works. So that's it. I have some things in the personal website. I organized a conference during COVID called Corporations and Democracy with a lot of other centers and law schools and centers, and that's it.
בהמשך למה שדיברנו
כן.
הרי אני חושב, התיאוריה הבסיסית של כלכלנים יהודיים, של why nation fail. Nation fail, כשיש corruption, כשהמערכת הפוליטית מפריעה למערכת, או מפריעה באופן אקטיבי למערכת הכלכלית, או לא מאפשרת למערכת הכלכלית להתנהג לפי הכללים הנורמליים. אבל באה ואומרת ש-corruption יכול להתרחש, ועדיין המערכת הכלכלית...
לא, ברור. מה זה מערכת כלכלית בשבילך? איך זה עובד? איך זה עובד? מי יגן לך, כשמישהו יעשה לך משהו, שמישהו לא יקיים חוזה, מה תעשה?
נכון. ברור, זה בדיוק מה שהם אומרים, אבל שאתה פונה לממשלה, ואת אומרת שעדיין יכול להיות מערכת כלכלית בעולם שבו, גם אם אתה מפר חוזה, לא קורה לך שום דבר.
ברור, זה הנקודה. הנקודה היא או שנניח אתה מפר חוזה, או אתה יוצר איזשהו נזק להמון אנשים שהם לא יכולים להתארגן ולעשות משהו על זה, ואין להם כלים חוקיים לעשות. אז למטרות רווח, זה משתלם. כלומר, משתלם לפגוע באנשים ומשתלם לשבור את הכללים, כי אין לזה עלויות. אז אם זה ככה, אז יכול להיות הביזנס מודל שלך לפגוע. אז אנחנו רואים הרבה דברים כאלו, שאתה יודע, אתה יכול להגיד שזה מאוד יצירתי, וכל המטרה שלו היא לא ברור בדיוק אם זה לטובה. אז תמיד אומרים, עם רגולציות, אז אין מספיק innovation, אין מספיק זה. אוקיי, אני ראיתי הרבה, גם יש מילים שתמיד יש להם קונוטציה חיובית. למשל, המילה קרדיט. כן, אז לא אומרים הלוואות או חובות, זה לא מילים נחמדות, אבל אם אתה אומר, אתן לך קרדיט, זה כמו בסוף הסרט, קרדיט, אז זה טוב. אשראי. אשראי זה מילה טובה. זה תמיד טוב, אבל זה שאחר כך צריך לשלם את זה, זאת אומרת, נתתי לך, זה, קודם יש כסף, מיידית. אחר כך, כן, באיזה תנאים, ומה יקרה כשלא תשלם, וכו' וכו', אם לא ילך. על זה לא מדברים, כן? העיקר שנתת לך אשראי. אז המילים האלה חיוביות. אותו דבר באמת יצירתיות ופטנטים והמצאות. אני אחד, לא ברור, תמיד. אז באמת ההמצאות, זה מה שהוא אמר. Financial Innovation, כמו בקריקטורה הזאת, אני תמיד אומרת את זה בעיקר על המצאות פיננסיות, שהרבה פעמים זה המצאות של מילים. עכשיו היה אחד מהכותרות קוראים לזה BNPL, Buy Now Pay Later. המציאו מילה חדשה, וקיבלת כסף, עכשיו אתה משלם אחר כך. אוקיי, היו לזה הרבה מילים אחרות. המציאו מחדש את כל המימון, וזה שעשו איזה מין וריאציה על כרטיס אשראי, על הלוואה, על משהו כזה. בסדר, אז בהמון תחומים זה ככה היה במימון. פתאום לא יכולת לשלם ריביות על פקדונות, אז המציאו לך את הקרנות כסף, money market funds, ועכשיו זה פתאום stable coins וכולי, זה עושה איזה מין סיבוב מילים כזה. המילה נופלת, נעשית לא פופולריות, או יש עליה רגולציה, אז משתמשים במילה אחרת. אז זה מהמצאה של מילים, לא של תוכן. אז טוב, אני נמצא עכשיו באמצע הקריפטו הייפ אצלנו. אז כן. יש הרבה לובי והרבה... כן.
So, I don't know if you read Tyler Cowen's book, Big Business and Defense of Corporations. So
Love letter.
Right. So I get all these very vivid examples you gave of corporations potentially harming social welfare. But what will you say, or do you think we can have a clear benchmark against which to manage our expectations? What we expect from corporations compared to social harms done by government or even plain individuals? So why?
Okay. There's no simple answer that certain size of corporation or certain type harmed by government. Of course, governments can cause harm. I mean, you have a governance problem everywhere. For me, the same language I use for all institutions in terms of what gives them the power, the legitimacy, and what are they doing, what they're supposed to be doing. Now, the government is different from private corporations. Obviously, there's a blurry line. Say, take prisons, okay? So government is the only one who can imprison. So the whole business of prisons is a government business to begin with. Now, who manages the prisons itself? I'm agnostic about that. The government can do a good job or a bad job managing prisons, and the government can hire a private company to manage a prison, and then it depends on the contract they write. So if you privatize an essential service, okay, so you can, in the US, you can privatize emergency services, say, okay, so the ambulance company is going to optimize, and then maybe it doesn't, it's okay if occasionally they come late. So it depends what your criteria are for how long an emergency service can arrive. You might say it's, more costs less money to have slightly less available ambulances, whatever. So it's, I come from the field of finance where we optimize all the time, net present value and all this stuff. The criteria I have is some kind of a, social welfare function. I don't know that we have that, but I believe that effective institutions can be private institutions or government institutions. But I think that the government is essential in sort of the ultimate. The government has the ultimate coercive power. Right? It has power over violence, over violent means of coercion, over prisons, over armies, etc. And the private sector, has to abide by rules that should help itself operate, should help people trust it for the right reasons, and that, I call it speed limits for corporations. I don't view it as a problem just because it's called regulation and it costs to comply. So I don't buy that narrative that we have to view regulation just because it's called regulation because it's a rule for corporations, or you could say that traffic laws regulate traffic. So the word regulation can be used to kind of control a system, a set of activities, and constrain some activities that are too dangerous, too reckless, so that driving at 70 miles an hour in the middle of the city. Why do we accept that? We accept that we will get punished if we violate that. So I think a sensible set of rules for corporations, and I can give you specific examples, by the way, where you'll see the difference also between countries. So one of the examples I sometimes bring, I took it out of this lecture because I didn't think I'd have enough time, is actually very close to home, to me. So I have a friend in Chicago. So this is specific to the US. So this is the capitalism of the US, which gives corporations very few rules on safety, product safety. So first they sell, and then we'll see, okay? So for example, children's products. So most people in the US think that children's products are safe, that they find on the stores. Well, it turns out they're not. So they are not subject to any independent testing. There's no Machon Atkanim, there's no independent agency, it's all industry. And if there's a problem, there's a very small agency called now it kind of rolls off my tongue, the CPSC, Consumer Product Safety Commission, incredibly weak agency with almost no money, no authority. It is in charge of 15,000 products, types, that are not cars, not drugs, not airplanes, not the ones that have special regulators, but all the furniture and the kids' products and the car seats and all this stuff. And almost none of these products have any safety standards at all. Now, my friend's child died from 16 months old in 1998, died from a crib that folds on the neck like that. And it kills a baby without a sound. So the caregiver can be in another room and she doesn't hear the child, okay? Now, they sold 1.5 million, 2 million of these kinds of cribs, okay? When a child dies from, so sometimes they're injured, sometimes they die, okay? When a child dies, most parents would not, would blame themselves, okay? So first of all, they think it's a freak accident, happened only to them. It's not a plane crashing, okay, where everybody sees it. It's just a dead child, okay? Now, if the parent is to sue the company for damages, the company will send the lawyers. I can assure you the CEO will not lose a lot of sleep over this. And the lawyer will maybe say, okay, we can settle this for whatever, $50,000. But you have to sign that you'll never talk about it. This is the opposite of taking up an ad in the paper to say, I produced. So you can take an ad in the paper to sell, but who takes an ad in the paper to recall a product? To say, if you have this product now, if it's a car, I know who you are, I send you a thing, take it to the dealer, you can replace this thing or that, okay? A crib that's defective, that's dangerous, they'll just let it stay. They let it stay. That's the optimal decision. The return on these things is less than 10% because people don't find out about it. And the recall is voluntary only. If you were to call that agency and ask, have there been any complaint about this product? They have to check with the company if they can disclose any information to you. This is how crazy this is. This is Section 6B of this law, okay? Once you get into the details, you see. Makes no sense, okay? The agency has no power at all. It doesn't ever give any fines. It doesn't do it. It reaches an agreement. The company says, okay, I recall these products. I no longer produce them. If you bring them back, I'll give you some money. But nobody brings it back because nobody knows about it because they are not required to tell people about it. So it's all in the information. It's all of that. So my friend has a nonprofit. The scrappiest of nonprofit, Kids in Danger. The entire purpose of the nonprofit is to fight for children's product safety, okay? Now, next to it is another nonprofit called Kids Safe. Kids Safe is also for safety of kids, but it never blames the manufacturers. So what happens? That nonprofit gets a lot of money from manufacturers, whereas my friend's nonprofit refuses to take money from manufacturers. So you see, even when you go to nonprofits, there's a lot of Coca-Cola and Pepsi support a lot of sports organization, the American Medical Association, all these things in order for them to stay quiet about the harms of sugar, etc. Yes?
I just want to add to that conversation. So if we know that the reality is that individuals and corporations with access to either enormous inequalities over or monopolies over, particularly information, like what you just described, that yields negative externalities that are very easy to identify and define and even to quantify. What role can the law play in being able to mitigate these ills or solve any of these issues? And if it's not the law, then what is that?
Okay, so the law is itself a product of a political process. So the law gets written by elected officials in a democracy anyway. And so the issue is, does the public understand what's going on? Does the public demand it? Or is the public sold all kinds of slogans, okay, about, love letters to big companies or whatever, without unpacking all the things that are there? I'm agnostic on size of companies. I just think some companies, I know this in banking for sure, grow way too inefficient for good and way too powerful too. But size could be efficient in some cases, so I'm not saying not. That's not true. But so that's why I emphasize. So in the end of my final quote, I said education is key. So what I try to do is just just savvy. Okay, so savvy when you deal with corporations, with the financial system, and savvy as a citizen. So you have to know how to ask, how to look beyond the statements. You have to know how to not get deceived and fooled by simple stories and simple lines. So the problem is that, you know, the epic battle to get inside your head is about propaganda, okay? So I had a slide there, I believe, about merchants of doubt. Merchants of doubt are climate deniers, okay? So that's the story of we don't know yet, we don't know yet, we don't know yet, which is sort of what they said about cigarettes for a while. They bought 20 years of selling cigarettes with no warning because we don't know yet if this cigarette killed that person or whatever. We don't know yet if climate change is real, so, okay, etc. Merchants of doubt is about propaganda, pure and simple. It starts with government propaganda and it goes to the advertisement, to the market, the field of marketing. So these are fields in the business school. So from my perspective as a finance professor, I think that, you know, the field of accounting is important only because it's about disclosures, and that we must get more information out of corporations. So certainly it is outrageous that the US, which has agreed to many agreements on beneficial owner transparency, is barely beginning to have it, and only for law enforcement, and who knows the enforcement of whether they actually reveal the actual beneficial owners of a corporation. And it was Delaware that fought against it for years and years, and the U.S. kept being behind on promises that it made. But why is it that there are a lot of disclosure requirements for investors? So investors can claim that they were deceived because they weren't told that, you know, your plane was going to kill some people, but customers are not entitled to disclosures. Employees need disclosures. So disclose to me, you know, your full safety record, all kinds of things like that I need to know in order to buy your product. Okay, so we have some rules about, you know, false advertising. We have some rules about what can or can't be advertised. But in the U.S., you know, you have a lot of pharmaceutical advertising. I mean, once you get to the pharma, it's like pharma is in big competition with finance sector for deception and confusing the knowledge that people have, controlling the data of researchers, all of that. So pharma controls medical journals. I mean, you know, once you go down the path of sources of knowledge, you know, there's a book in the US called Sickening, and it's all about pharma, a recent book. So once you dig into some of these areas, the knowledge control is massive, and until you unpack that, it's hard to control.
The onus of responsibility and safety and protection,
Yeah.
you're saying, falls on the individual citizen, independent of their
Yeah.
socioeconomic status and their access to information.
But the law can give tools, and the question is, is it cost beneficial? So now you get into the world of private lawyers and their incentives. So what will they take, and what's the hourly, you know, charge of a lawyer to do anything? So when it's spread out, it's very difficult to get any justice, and maybe your path to a lawsuit is blocked, and so you're powerless in the law. So the question is how who the law enables to act, to enforce, and whether the government should do more to protect some people who can't protect themselves when they need protection. So it's really a matter of basic justice of the system. You have a question?
Okay. One last question.
One last question.
So I'm wondering if I appreciate your optimism that we can fix what's wrong, specifically in America, and I'm wondering what you think about is we're really starting, I think, to come to be more aware of the influence of dark money in America.
Yeah.
The influence of the religious right,
Yeah.
the machinations of what has been happening so far behind the scenes
Yeah.
in the political landscape. It's mind-boggling, and it's a master class of strategy and deception of what has. I mean, it
Yep.
is disgusting, and it leads me to wonder if the system can even be saved, because it has been so badly dismantled and damaged from the inside with the intent of deceiving
Yeah.
the American people, that they have bought it lock, stock, and barrel, that regulation is horrible because it costs us
Yeah.
money.
So that's why, yeah. So how to unpack? I mean, I agree. You know, there are all kinds of ways to kind of get to the root of it. So some people say it's campaign financing laws. So you know, Larry Lessig in Republic lost and all of that. So it's called corruptive dependencies, he calls it. So I mean, you know, when you look at, and you know, money has come to dominate politics and law. So that's really where, I mean, where it gets scary. And I agree with you. So, you know, what a good revolution, I mean, you know, I try to remain optimistic only because I feel that otherwise you kind of don't do anything. And so, you know, I find some things to do that I feel on the margin will help, but it's overwhelming. I agree with you. So it can be overwhelming to sort of face this situation.
Right, because it sort of seems to me like, on the one hand, we can say the system is broken. We can identify all these ways like that you've highlighted, and then when we go to look to fix them, you run into people like Mitch McConnell, and it's not just that he's got plans for today. He's been planning since high school. You know, it becomes the whole game has been changed without anybody really paying attention.
Well, I mean, I think that's right. There's a cynical view of that, but I think that.
I mean, I hope it's just cynical.
Yeah, no. I mean, I think there have been, you know, the Gilded Ages in the Gilded Age in the U.S. was followed by, you know, by all kinds of revolution that brought a lot of rights to a lot of people and built a system of safety nets that has eroded, but you know, it happened before. So you know, you have I think the political dynamics are kind of harder to predict, and so I don't know what the boiling point looks like on these issues, and who gives people the insight that somehow it clicks what's wrong. But the real concern, and I had a slide there also about unfocused anger, because that's where a demagogue will come and take it to divert it away. So that's sort of the Trump thing, sort of picking up on the anger and saying, oh, be mad with immigrants, or be mad with, you know, with the blacks and with others, and sort of, you know, he's going to drain the swamp, you know, so while being as more swampy than any. So it is amazing how much you can get away with if you are good at that persuasion art.
Yes.
And so, you know, but can you get, I mean, you know, the right now, you know, you can have an authentic guy like this Pennsylvania Senate what's his name? Fetterman. So if you have a Fetterman, you know, the guy is very, very genuine, okay? And so it's amazing. I do believe, by the way, in general, stepping back, that one person can make a difference at a given point of time, okay? And so, you know, you had the Brandeis, or you had in South Africa, you had Anwar Sadat. I mean, you had people who single-handedly changed the world for the better. So, what it's going to take that suddenly, you know, somebody will show the light. I mean, there's hope. So I try to.
And on this optimistic
Yeah.
note,
Yes,
thank you.
yes, thank you.
Good luck.